The package comes less than a week after I order it. I am excited but hesitant. It is smaller and softer than I was expecting. I am about to put several years of active listening in the field to the test. Every rug hooker I know is several provinces away. The only helpers I can count on are my 3 cats, who are currently waiting for me to empty the package so they can crawl inside. I reach into the package and remove a large piece of burlap, which will be soon stamped with a design of my choosing and hooked into a small rug. The cats crawl into the discarded package, and I hunt around my sewing box for the yarn and fabric strips I have been saving for this project. Varying shades of blue and green, black wool yarn, fluffy white cotton. It occurs to me that I have no idea how to hook fluffy cotton, only fabric strips or threads of wool. Even then, it's not so much that I know how to hook them in a practical way, but more that I understand it in theory. But the leap from theory to practice is a big one. I'm about to hook my first rug. Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Gerald Pocius's Hooked Rugs in Newfoundland, the representation of social structure in design. This is a great article, not simply for Atlantic Canada Studies or Newfoundland Studies, but because it is a great illustration of some very elemental ideas about folklore. So you have this idea of, or you have this need for a mat. You have a practical thing that needs to be part of a house in somewhere north of the 45th parallel, where there are winters, where insulation is not necessarily going to be happening, and you want something to cushion fate. Do I need to explain the concept of a mat? Probably not. But there is a practical need to be met. But once you establish that there is a practical need to be met, it doesn't mean that there aren't aesthetic ways of doing so. When we go back to our basic definition of folklore, the Dan Benamos folklore definition from 1972, artistic communication in small groups, you might not necessarily think of a rug or a hooked mat at the first moment as a form of communication, although Jerry goes on to suggest this. But rather, I like the idea of thinking about what we mean by artistic. Do we necessarily mean art in that capital A sense, something that is enshrined, something that is is meant to be sort of venerated and become this almost this object of to be beheld? And we certainly, there are folkloric things that are like that, very marked genres, the fairy tale, the certain forms of ritual, certain forms of material culture, even more elaborate than this, something that draws attention to itself almost for little other purpose apart from drawing attention to itself. There's various definitions of art. We don't need to go into them, but we're not talking about art, capital A and period at the end. We're talking about the idea of something being artistic. It can be done in any number of ways, but the way it is done is appealing to something over and above its mere utilitarian function. And the way it is done is something that is recognized as appropriate, or recognized as interesting, or recognized as comfortably esoteric, or recognized as cool. I mean, what adjective do we need? Something that, again, over and above. So, I mean, one of the things we might talk about are things like how we greet each other. And I mean, because greeting each other is a functional thing, and we can probably point to most societies having some verbal way of greeting each other. But we can do it in all sorts of different ways. And hello, hi, how are you? How's it going? Ba 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 ba. We can do the nod. We don't even need to talk. We can do it in some kind of physical way. But how we greet each other is going to be that we greet each other might be universal. How we greet each other is going to be specific to the group. On the very minor level, we're not necessarily talking about how Newfoundlanders or how Atlantic Canadians greet each other, because they are complex, heterogeneous people, and they'll belong to multiple groups. And so the way that you say hello to your grandmother is different from the way you say hello to your friends, or different how you say hello online, or different how you say hello to your professor, where you should bow and scrape and offer them candy. So artistic. So now we have this hooked rug. we have a functional thing that needs to be in place, and then we have the skill set that is required to create it, because it is a thing. It is an object that requires it to be manufactured. And then there is the decision about how it is to be rendered. And that has to do in large part with this theme of audience, and that folklore is so much the understanding, or the study of folklore is so much the understanding of the intended audiences for these objects. So we have the rug. And the rug is typical and present in the Newfoundland outboard. It's part of women's domestic labor. It is something that is done in the winter, often at the same time as men are doing the repair work on nets for the winter. And, he sets off that lovely vignette at the beginning where after the mummering season and so on. So the height of January. And basically every year you got to make a couple more rugs because they are functional objects and they wear out and they need to be replaced. And what does one make them with? Well, one makes them with found materials. Old scraps of material, old scraps of fabric, either from clothes that are too shop worn to be repaired again or mended anew. And burlap, which would have been present from through trade, and how goods would have been shipped in, so bags of oats and so on. Do I need to explain burlap? But a rough fabric. It's set out, a design is drawn on it in some way, and then a fairly almost universal form of stitching, a very regular stitching. And the stitching is a technique that is more or less standard. And again, as Laura Sanchini goes on to describe it in her description of her first effort at doing a rug unaccompanied. The burlap is stretched across my cheery yellow frame, ready for me to begin. I start by holding a strip of baby blue cloth under the burlap, and using my hook, bring a small loop of the cloth through a hole in the burlap. My first loop. I am very proud of this first perfect loop. The next few loops come up easily. Then I tug a bit too hard and accidentally unravel the whole line of carefully hooked loops. I begin again, over and over, again and again. I unravel lines of loops or pull my hook too aggressively through the burlap, making the hole too big to properly hold a loop. Constantly fixing mistakes. I am happy no one is around to see this. Just to be fair, Laura is writing about the Cheticamp hooked rug tradition as opposed to the Newfoundland hooked rug tradition, but the mechanics are very much the same. The aesthetics are different, but I would direct you to her work because we are talking about Jerry Pocius's work. And I will direct you to her work because she is talking about the Cheticamp hooked rugs basically within the 21st century, how they are mostly a tourist and craft economy based industry as opposed to the thing that we need to do in order to insulate our houses and provide some kind of relief to our feet as we are working. The two contexts of the hooked mats. So the map is out. The stitch is fairly regular, fairly universal. It is something that presumably early on enough in one's domestic training, one learns how to make the stitch appropriately, and then it is just part of the domestic repertoire of skills. Jerry doesn't talk about it that much, but because he doesn't talk about failed rugs, or he isn't ethnographically present to someone doing their first rug, but a uniform stitch. The issue is the design, and that is the basis of it. So once you have that freedom, what design are you going to do? And that's the meat of this. That is the artistic aspect of this communication in small groups. And he notes a number of different themes that are in place, and one has to do with geometry. That geometric designs are the easiest. Basically, you can sort of establish what colors you have. You barely need to draw them because you could use the weave of the burlap itself as a way of counting. Just like every 10, I'm going to switch, and you can just do little checkerboards or little squares, or that's fine. You can draw lines just with straight edges and create various forms of geometry. You are still looking for something that is going to be attractive, something that is going to be neat. And probably in large part because you are dealing with a grid, randomness isn't necessarily something that is easily accessible, nor would it be practical to make, because you wouldn't want to sort of do a kind of scatter shot in large part because you'd be having on the back, you'd be having sort of strings work across strips of fabric working across. You'd be clustering your shapes. The mechanics of it would be kind of interesting. So geometry, but then there's this other set of patterns. And this other set has to do with something that is not mere geometry, something that is somewhat more figurative. Either a two-dimensional image that is drawn from something and is often drawn from someone else's rendering of an object into two. So we have, and he gives the example of a bedspread that had a floral design on it, and then that floral design was extrapolated by the rug hooker and put onto a piece of burlap, and that formed the basis of it. So again, folk taking the things in their environment and working them into their design. So this kind of regenerative form, even for a form that we can argue and make the case is an old-fashioned traditional form, whatever is available. Wall calendars were one of the things that were suggested as a possible loop. And he even points out to one example of a gas station sign that seemed to potentially hint a possible design for one of the hookers. Rug hookers love being called hookers. Seriously, it's kind of an in-joke, and you start to appreciate it over time, and then you don't, and then you do again. So they have, in their environment, they bring whatever resources they have to this thing. Now, and sometimes they try and create something where they're not extrapolating someone else's two-dimension, but perhaps introducing a three-dimensional object into the two. And he has that great description of someone who kind of wanted to do their cat and did so by putting their cat down on the burlap and tracing around the cat, and two hilarious octopus protoplasm style outline. And just the idea of like tracing a cat is kind of a wonderful notion. That might be fanciful. That was from a guide in the 1920s. So take that as you may. But it's indicative of something. So there is given that this is still a practical thing, there is a certain pleasure, like in all things, taken in doing a job well. So there's the benefit that comes from doing a good job, a nice uniform looping, that forms basically that kind of, for lack of a better word, stitch that is on the rug, because that as a piece of engineering, that's important because it means that it's going to last. This is a product of labor, and you do not want labor to be wasted, so you do it well. You also don't want to attract attention to it by it being done poorly. And then an economic use of strips, and then an aesthetic use of strips, an interesting way of assembling these, using your understanding of previous rugs, of how rugs are understood in the community, and of other crafts. I mean, he points out that quilting design is one of the ways of being an inspiration for rug hooking design. Now, quilting and rug hooking, they're both two-dimensional fabric crafts, but one is taking assembled pieces and cutting them out and then patching them together, and one is just it's a grid. It's actually remarkably binary, and you can actually take things like cross-stitch patterns and rug hook patterns and put them into digital art in a very interesting extrapolation, because it's one color per square, and it's just a grid, which is different from what a quilt is. But the quilts will inspire, because again, you tend to cluster colors together when you are doing this. So it is half of a grid and half of a what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like a bitmap, in that these subscribed areas are going to be subscribed colors. One of the points that he makes is that there are these moments where someone will try a new design from a calendar, from their own noggin, and then it'll quickly enter into the repertoire. So very much like a new recipe, very much like a new song. New ideas are brought into the repertoire all the time. People create new things, and once one person creates a new thing, many people will repeat it. There isn't that sort of sense of ownership. There isn't that sense, even if the group collectively says, well, Mary made this one the first time and it was just wonderful, and so we all made it. There isn't this sort of artistic idea that would be held in sort of a more contemporary art world, that this is something that is specifically forever this person's property, that their intellectual effort becomes associated with them and theirs alone. It enters into, quote unquote, the tradition very quickly, very spontaneously, and will stay for a number of years. So it is interesting that doesn't necessarily follow the folk aesthetic and certainly the art aesthetic that we think of. That even though attention is attracted towards the maker, there's just as much that is something that is found to be delightful, and therefore something that will be imitated and reproduced in other homes very quickly, because it is meeting the aesthetics of the group. It's like, oh, that's wonderful, I'm going to make one of those too. Which is, I think in the 21st century, we sometimes find that idea of imitation somehow inauthentic, or somehow an act of inauthenticity. And I think there's actually a lot to be said about, you're doing this thing, I am going to do this thing too, and certain forms of digital culture. I'm just thinking off the top of my head now. And then they are potential display events, and they're display events to two different people. And this is where you get that subtitle, the representation of social structure. Because with these more fanciful or fancy and more rugs, these rugs that demonstrate not simply the ability to construct a rug, but the ability to construct an attractive, a unique, a distinct, a piece of art. Something that will draw the eye to it profoundly, and look at that, what a wondrous thing. And those rugs aren't going to be in the social space of the house that is for regular display events. It's going to be in the part of the house that's for special display events. He's not using this exact language, but the language that he uses extrapolates exactly on the language that I use in terms of this understanding of audience. Because the Newfoundland house, like many of our houses, it's perhaps extreme in the Newfoundland sense because we're typically dealing with 2 rooms in the downstairs. There is the kitchen area, which is a public space. It's public space in terms of people from all over the community might come in that very non-hierarchical level. This is an outport. These are friends, these are colleagues, these are sometimes kin relationships, and the idea of the kitchen party is sort of a 20th, 21st extension, or late 20th century extension of this idea. But the notion of house visits are a regular occurrence, and the way that third spaces are created in homes and in kitchens in particular, to the point of, doors are always unlocked and people have no problem walking in, and or I would have no problem with you walking into the kitchen and so on. I mean, it's recognized as theirs, but it's also recognized as public in the same sphere. And then there is the front parlor, the front room. And the front room is typically only kept for certain special occasions. Visits from the merchant, who is of a different status. We don't necessarily need to use the word class here, but definitely of a status. They are someone who controls the economy by being typically the only outlet for both where goods can be got and where fish, the prime economic generator of the communities, for fish can be sold. So they are the node through which economic surety happens through the community. And so when the merchant comes, they are in the special room. The second is the priest. And the priest comes and he is entertained in the front room similarly. And that is a different kind of performance space. The third would be typically for the house wake. So if someone in the family has died, they are laid out in the house for a few days. The community gathers together. You can read about house wakes in a number of different articles, including Peter Narvaez's one on tricks and fun at house wakes. But that room becomes sacred. I mean, it's always special, but in this way it becomes sacred. That's one of the few times when ordinary members of the community, i.e. not the merchant, not the priest, the people who would typically be in the kitchen, that's one of the few times they actually go into that front room. And they go into that front room because of the occasion aspect. So we think about how front room is decorated. That has the better furniture. That has things like the photographs of the family. You could use the word ancestor altars, but family mementos, a good cross, perhaps for Catholic families. And they are stages. They are material spaces for how the family wishes to present itself in the more formal aspects. And you can think of this yourself. In your house, you probably have a room which, when someone comes in, your bossy relative, the aunt that you're always trying to impress, or perhaps the priest, or business associates or whatever, they have the special room. They do not go into other rooms in the house. They're not hanging out in the TV room. They're hanging out in the living room. They're not hanging out in your bedroom. Not these level of guests. They're hanging out in these special places. And how do you decorate that place? How do you decorate that space? You do it with fancier stuff. And one of the fancier things are these rugs. And these rugs, all of a sudden, because this is a different performance context, because this is a different audience, these rugs, which are the product of the same brain, the same creativity as the rugs in the kitchen, are the fancier rugs. They are not ones that are walked on often. Sometimes they are just put in the corner and only laid out when guests are coming. Sometimes there's an oilcloth put on them, but they are kept for good because their utilitarian function is actually secondary to their display function, as opposed to in the kitchen space where their utilitarian function is more important than their display function. There's the expectation that they still look good, and looking good is according to the aesthetics of the community, but with a recognition that these are finite, ephemeral objects that are meant to be used, as opposed to these objects in the front room. It's these objects in the front room, of course, that attract much more attention and enter into the when folklorists and ethnographers, when tourist operators, when people who are doing cultural interventions and trying to demonstrate, trying to perhaps take local craft traditions and create some kind of economic basis for them, like what happens in Cheticamp, like what Grenfell did to a certain extent in the Grenfell missions, or the people from the Grenfell missions did on the west coast of Labrador, west coast of Newfoundland, east coast of Labrador. One of the things they saw was the hooked rugs, and said, there would be a market for these. It wouldn't necessarily be for the market, the geometric designs that would be in the kitchen. It would be for the more artfully rendered, idiosyncratic, unique display event rugs that were in the front room. That might also be coincidence, and that's where you would entertain these people to begin with, and they'd only see this. But then, as the 20th century progresses, as houses don't need these kind of mats nearly as much for utilitarian purposes because of things like insulation and new materials, or the end of the outport entirely and the move into the suburbs of St. John's and Corner Brook, and sort of just general shifts in the social structure in the late 20th century. These things that were once largely a skill set that was largely about utilitarian and occasionally blended into the artistic for particular kind of display events, now becomes the artistic, almost exclusively. Rugs stop being on the floor and start being on the walls. People start shaping them for different sizes. So can I have like coasters? Can I have, placemats? It's like, okay. And again, because even in the front room, they're still serving that utilitarian purpose of being a mat. And now what happens when you take a rug and you put it on the wall? It changes it as an object. It attracts attention to it. And it goes back to that idea of art, that all of a sudden these things, again, this artistic communication in small groups, where you have this notion of a thing that does not necessarily, as, well, we were talking about art as a thing that attracts attention to itself and is almost there exclusively to be beheld, as opposed to something being merely artistic. Now you have these things that are attention being held, directed towards themselves purely for that. You have a rug, you go to Shedicamp, you can buy them through stores. You go to Newfoundland, you can buy them through stores. You can buy these kits and learn how to do it at home and be like your own Shedicamp or Newfoundland crafter. And it becomes this much more highly performative process in terms of making. At least in terms of the crafts of the kits that are sold. The actual making of them for the tourist economy is a very different thing. Again, I refer you to Laura Sanchini's work. But the objects themselves become objects of to be beheld, to be sold to people who are interested in this kind of folk ingenuity, folk artistic expression. And it just recontextualizes them. You can make an argument that it decontextualizes them, and that's fine. That's one way of going, but I think recontextualize is probably a better expression. So this is a great example of something that we see in Atlantic Canada, where these things that we do, if you wanted to take folklore to its sort of basic descriptor of folklore, is just the things that we do. It's only in retrospect that they become sort of enshrined in things. In retrospect, either from outsiders to say, hey, that thing that you do is very neat, or generations hence, hey, that thing we used to do, we don't do that anymore. What happened? And so this thing that we do, we make rugs for our homes, and we try and make them a little bit pretty. And for the front room, we try and make them even more pretty. It's just now a different context, and they are different. Some will make an argument for better, some will make an argument for worse. I will just simply make an argument for different. So anyway, this is a very short, very descriptive, and no, not descriptive in a negative way, but I mean, I think it is so well written that it kind of speaks for itself. I think it works very well, and it's illustrates, as I said, these basic ideas of folklore, that it can be done a number of ways, and within this group it is done this way. Let's examine why, and let's examine that on that sort of micro level. But it has to do with aesthetics, how the group understands what is appropriate, what is pretty, what is expected, what is delightful, how within those guidelines creativity happens, and how creativity is sometimes something that has attention drawn to itself depending on the audience. He uses the word non-hierarchical and hierarchical audiences. Cool, that works as well. That's the language that we could continue. If you don't find that comfortable, it might just be like in-group or esoteric and exoteric, however one wants to engage. It's a great article. A classic. Okay, until next time, my friends, I'm Ian. I wish you nothing but the best. And as ever, be well. Bye-bye.